Okay, let's try this again. So, welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable for February 18th, 2026. My name is Adam Bentz, and I'm the Director of Library and Archives at the York County History Center. We're very happy to work with the York Civil War Roundtable, led by Kathy Friel, Program Director, and Scott Mingus and Scott Rosenau, Assistant Program Directors. We have a great speaker for tonight and a very interesting, and I don't think we don't usually delve too much into the political history of the Civil War period in the Civil War Roundtable. So I'm personally looking forward to this tonight. Um, and we will get started with Mr. Stahr's presentation in a few minutes. So if you're willing to bear with me, I am just going to go through some coming attractions at the History Center over the next few weeks. This coming Saturday, February 21st at 1 o'clock p.m. in the History Center's Wareheim Room, we will be welcoming uh, Dr. Dorothy King and a group of performers who will be performing a play that she's written called Miss Lydia's Church. This is in honor of Black History Month at the History Center. Again, that's February 21st, Saturday at 1 p.m. Next Wednesday, if my math is correct, February 25th, at 6:30 p.m. in the History Center's coffee shop, which is, believe it or not, a venue in the new History Center. We're trying it out. We will be having a guided group discussion, including yours truly, of Ken Burns' The American Revolution documentary series that premiered last year. This is a ticketed event, but the tickets, I believe, are $5 for non-History Center members. So if you're interested, please check out the History Center website. We have plenty of spots available for this. We're trying a new series called Coffee and Conversations, and starting next Wednesday night, talking about Ken Burns. So please put that on your calendars if you're interested. It should be a good night. On March 1st, that Sunday, March 1st at 2:30 p.m., again in the Wareheim Room in the third floor of the History Center, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be in attendance, and they are presenting attorney Richard Conkle, who is vice president of South Central, and he will be discussing using estate records in genealogy research. I've talked to him about this before, and he is an expert, so it should be a great presentation. And finally, on Thursday, March 5th at 7 o'clock p.m., again, third floor Wareheim Room, Writers Roundtable, which is a library program, a library partner program, will be welcoming Nisi DeShields Moulton, Tina Charles, and Becky Anstein. And the three ladies will be discussing family history research and cemetery restoration. So that's the Writers Roundtable on March 5th, 7 o'clock p.m. And last but certainly not least, on March 18th, believe it or not, that's only 4 weeks from tonight. I'm looking forward to March. I'm sure a lot of people are. Um, the day after St. Patrick's Day, it didn't work out this year that it's on St. Patrick's Day, but in honor of St. Patrick, we'll be welcoming our own Scott Mingus. I say our own because he's, of course, one of the key members of the Roundtable and a prolific author of York County's Civil War history. He will be presenting The Irish at Fredericksburg. So, at the start of the Civil War, President Lincoln and his supporters reached out to several leaders in the Irish American community, despite the fact that many of them were Democrats, to obtain their assistance in recruiting men for the Union Army. Thousands of Irish volunteers responded, forming multiple regiments, sorry about that, across the North. Several of these regiments were organized together under Brigadier General Thomas F. Meagher in what became famed as the Irish Brigade. Scott Mingus, co-author of Erin go Bragh, Human Interest Stories of the Irish in the American Civil War, will discuss the Irish Brigade's ill-fated assault on the Confederate lines at the 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg. He will follow the advance of the boxwood-adorned Irish as they march through Fredericksburg streets to their destiny. So, like I said, 4 weeks from tonight, we'll be having Scott, and this is an in-person session. We'll be returning to in-person on the third floor of the History Center on Wednesday, March 18th. So please stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, coming all the way via television from California. California sounds great to Pennsylvanians right now, but Mr. Starr told me it's pretty rainy there right now, but maybe a little bit warmer than it is here. So tonight he'll be discussing Chase and Lincoln. Walter Stahr is an honors graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School. After practicing law for 20 years, he turned to writing biographies. His first book was about the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, published in 2005. After that, he wrote biographies of three of the most important figures in Lincoln's cabinet: Secretary of State William Henry Seward in 2012, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in 2017, and Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase in 2023. These biographies have been bestsellers and prize winners. The Chase biography won the 2023 Thomas M. Cooley Book Prize from the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Stahr recently completed a biography of President and later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Howard Taft. And he just told me today that this book is currently in the proof stage with Simon & Schuster, with a release date of November 10th, 2026, so not too far from now. In addition to his more famous accomplishments, William Howard Taft played a key role in the erection of the Lincoln Memorial. So, and also, Walter is a descendant, just to give his Civil War bona fides, he is a descendant of a Berks County, Pennsylvania resident who served in the 128th Pennsylvania Volunteers and fought at Antietam. So, if everyone could hold your questions to the end and submit them to the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will do this as we did last month. We'll be happy to field your questions. And thank you very much for attending tonight. I'll turn things over to Mr. Stahr.
Thanks. Thank you all for being here on and how to put it, foregoing other entertainments this evening. So talking to Adam this morning, I realized that you all are very focused on the Continental Congress and its months in York, and I mentioned that my first book about John Jay has quite a bit about the Continental Congress, and I realized, where was Jay during the months September 77 through June of 78 when the Congress was in York? The answer is that although he was a member of Congress both before that period and afterwards, not long thereafter, indeed, he was the president of the Continental Congress, he was not among the members who was in York. Why? Is it that he disliked York? No. He was busy in the new state of New York. During 1777, he was a member of the New York State Convention, essentially the legislature. He was the principal author of the first state constitution, and then he was the first Chief Justice of the state. That state government, like the Confederation government that was sitting in York, was a government in exile. The traditional capital of the colony, New York City, was under British control. So when Jay, as Chief Justice, opened the first session of the state Supreme Court in September of 1777, it was neither in New York City, nor in Albany, nor in any other city. It was in the little village of Kingston, New York, where the state government was sitting at that point, but only for a few weeks. As British troops approached, they fled from Kingston and later regrouped in Albany. So in a sense, the state government of which Jay is a part at this period is very like the Confederation government in York. He was in close touch with friends who were in the Continental Congress in York, including Gouverneur Morris and Philip Schuyler. And as I mentioned, would soon kind of go back to the Continental Congress, but that was by the time they had returned to Philadelphia. So I can and will take questions about Jay, but let me shift now to Salmon Chase, very serious looking figure. As one of my friends who interviewed me said about him, a more impressive than likable man. Salmon Portland Chase, he always hated what he called his fishy name, was about the same age as Abraham Lincoln. He was born in New Hampshire in 1808, Lincoln in Kentucky in 1809. Unlike Lincoln, Chase had a college degree. He was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Dartmouth. Chase spent Spart. After graduating, Chase went down to D.C., where he read law with William Wirt, the Attorney General, and where he knew Daniel Webster. When he started his legal career, however, he moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, more or less like Lincoln moved to Springfield. They both started their political career as Whigs, with Lincoln serving in the state legislature and Chase on the Cincinnati City Council. But in 1841, Chase left the Whig Party and joined the tiny Liberty Party. He was disgusted with the subservience of the two main political parties to Southern slave owners. Um, when I say tiny, I mean tiny. In the prior year, in the 1840 presidential election, only 7,000 men nationwide voted for the Liberty Party, less than 1/3 of 1% of the votes. As soon as he joined the Liberty Party, Chase set out to change and strengthen it. He distinguished between abolitionism, an impractical demand to end slavery immediately, and anti-slavery, getting the federal government out of the slavery business, for example, by ending slavery in the District of Columbia. He embraced the Constitution and interpreted it as an anti-slavery document rather than denouncing the Constitution, like the abolitionist editor William Lloyd Garrison, who famously burned a copy of the Constitution at a 4th of July rally. In 1844, so a couple years after joining the Liberty Party, he published something called the Liberty Man's Creed, which was a good summary of his views on slavery at that time. He started with Thomas Jefferson, very appropriate for us this year. I believe all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Chase argued very explicitly that when Jefferson said all men, he meant black and white men, because Chase believed, perhaps a little without evidence, but he believed firmly that Jefferson and the other founding fathers were opposed to slavery. He said, I believe that the settled policy of the American government at the time of the adoption of the Constitution was to limit and localize, not to extend and nationalize slavery. Chase declared that the Constitution, quote, confers on Congress no power to establish or uphold slavery anywhere, but on the contrary, expressly prohibits the general government from depriving any person of liberty except by due process of law. This implied, in his mind, that slavery was unconstitutional in the District of Columbia, and indeed in the territory of Florida, and in all the states that had been created out of any territory of the United States. He would later change his mind about places like Florida, but in 1844, his view was that the only place that slavery was legal and constitutional was in places like South Carolina, i.e., among the original 13 states. So Chase is active in anti-slavery politics. He's also active in what we would call, pro bono legal work on behalf both of free blacks and those accused of being fugitive slaves. After one of these fugitive cases in 1845, the blacks of Cincinnati thanked Chase by presenting him with a silver pitcher. It's about yay tall, and you can see it today if you want at the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. In his speech thanking the Black community, Chase denounced the provision in the Ohio Constitution denying Blacks the right to vote, declaring that true democracy makes no inquiry about the color of the skin or the place of nativity or any other similar circumstance or condition. Chase also denounced in this speech the state's practice of excluding blacks from public schools, insisting this was contrary to the state constitution, which promised public education for every grade without any distinction or preference whatever. These were bold statements in 1845, and Chase ensured that they were widely read through a printed pamphlet. These statements would be quoted back against Chase in later political campaigns under headlines that accused Chase of favoring black voting and integrated schools. The headlines used a word for black Americans that I cannot repeat in polite company. Lincoln never made such statements, and Lincoln, as a lawyer, never represented a fugitive slave. Indeed, in 1847, Lincoln represented a Kentucky master, Robert Matson, who was keeping Jane Bryant and her black children as slaves in Illinois. Lincoln argued that Matson was permitted to keep slaves temporarily in Illinois, a free state, even though Jane had been enslaved there for 2 years. The Illinois court rejected Lincoln's argument and declared Jane free. I suspect that even among you Civil War buffs, that some of you haven't even heard of the Matson case, and that's because most of Lincoln's biographers do not even mention the case, and others sort of downplay it, and only a few really deal with it and condemn Lincoln for taking on the case. As you can tell by my tone, I'm one of those who would condemn Lincoln for choosing to represent this slave owner. Chase and his friends made amazing progress in political anti-slavery. In the 1844 presidential election, the Liberties Party's share of the vote increased to a respectable 2.3%. And in 1848, Chase and others engineered a merger of the Liberty Party with anti-slavery elements of the Whigs and Democrats, forming a new party, the Free Soil Party, which received about 15% of the votes in the presidential election. Chase presided over the Free Soil Party's first national convention. He authored the famous Free Soil Platform. He campaigned for free soil candidates. Lincoln campaigned for the Whigs in 1848, and in some of his speeches mocked and denigrated the Free Soilers, calling them rabid abolitionists. In the winter of 1848-49, in the Ohio legislature, Chase and others devised a compromise between the Free Soil and Democratic parties. Chase and other Free Soilers would support the Democrats in their effort to control the legislature, and in return, the Democrats would repeal some of the state's black laws, the laws that discriminated explicitly against blacks, and would support Chase as the state's next federal senator. Thus it was that Chase went to Washington in the spring of 1849 as what he called Free Soil Democratic senator. Over the next 6 years in the Senate, Chase continued to argue against slavery, especially against the stronger fugitive slave law passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. Chase was a leader of those who opposed Senator Stephen Douglas and his 1854 Kansas-Nebraska bill because the bill allowed slavery in territory which the Missouri Compromise had promised would remain free. Chase spent that spring giving speeches in Congress and urging people to oppose what he called the Nebraska iniquity. With patronage pressure from President Franklin Pierce and with support from some Southern Whigs, Douglas managed to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress, and Pierce signed the bill into law in late May 1854. What was Abraham Lincoln doing in the spring of 1854 while Chase was fighting the Nebraska bill in Congress and many others were opposing it in speeches and rallies and editorials throughout the North? Nothing, or more precisely, he was busy working as a lawyer. He was doing nothing to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Some think that he was the author of an article against the bill that appeared in the Illinois State Journal in late March of 54, but there's no proof of this. Lincoln doesn't mention the editorial or the bill in any of his surviving letters from the early part of the year. Lincoln finally spoke out against the Kansas-Nebraska bill in his Peoria speech on October 16, 1854, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. It was a great speech, but rather late. Chase, if he'd been asked, would have said it's a great speech, but too late. Where was Lincoln when we needed him in the spring? As best I can tell, by the by, Chase did not even notice the Peoria speech. It's famous today because it was by Abraham Lincoln, who's famous today, but it was not. It didn't get press attention outside of Illinois. In 1855, Ohio voters selected Chase as their governor, the first Republican governor of a major state. Chase continued his fight against slavery while in Columbus as governor. For example, he urged the Ohio legislature to strengthen laws against kidnapping. It was all too common for free blacks to be kidnapped by those who falsely claimed that they were fugitive slaves. In 1858, when Lincoln campaigned against Douglas in Illinois for the Senate seat, Chase campaigned for Lincoln. There were many out-of-state Republicans who actually favored Douglas in that election because they saw him dividing the Democratic Party into Douglas and Buchanan wings. In other words, for tactical reasons, these Republicans were willing to support Douglas. Chase was not one of these. He favored Lincoln, whom he saw as a reliable Republican, over Douglas, whom he saw as dangerous, and Lincoln was grateful to Chase for his help writing him early in the new year after he had lost the election to thank him for his support. Later in 1859, there was an interesting exchange between the two men about the Fugitive Slave Act. Ohio Republicans, outraged by some fugitive slave cases, included in their state Republican platform a call for repeal of the federal fugitive slave law. Lincoln wrote to Chase to say that the Ohio plank was already damaging us here in Illinois, and that if such language were introduced the next year at the National Convention, it would shatter the Republican Party. Chase answered Lincoln that he agreed the Republican Party should avoid extremes. But he then set out why he and others favored repeal of the fugitive slave law. There are many who believe that act is entirely unconstitutional because Congress has no power of legislation upon the subject, or because it provides no trial by jury, while others think it is unconstitutional in part because it vests judicial power in commissioners and for other reasons. Lincoln was not persuaded. These were two lawyers debating a legal question. He admitted to Chase in a response that the Constitution did not state that Congress had authority to implement the Fugitive Slave Clause. But in Lincoln's view, whatever the Constitution says shall be done, and is omitted saying who shall do it, the government established by that Constitution, by implication, is vested with the power of doing. He stressed, however, that his purpose was not to debate with Chase the constitutional question, but rather to raise the political point that pressing for repeal of the fugitive slave law would be disastrous for the Republicans. As 1860 started, the presidential year, Chase was among the leading candidates for the Republican presidential nomination, along with his New York colleague, William Henry Seward. Lincoln was very much a dark horse. So why did the 1860 Chicago Convention nominate Lincoln rather than Chase or Seward? For the full story, you need to read either my Chase book or my Lincoln book, or sorry, my Seward book, or both. But the short version is that in order to win the general election, the Republicans were going to have to carry almost all the free states because they were not going to get any votes in the slave states. And that meant winning in some states like Illinois and Indiana that Democrats had carried in 1856. Delegates from those states at the Chicago Convention told others that if the nominee was Seward or Chase, they would not win in their states. Seward and Chase were just too radical on Black rights. And Pennsylvania was one of the states, I should say, that made this argument at the Chicago Convention. Lincoln rather than Seward or Chase, because Lincoln can carry Pennsylvania, Seward and Chase cannot. Um, Lincoln, at this point, although he is in a sense anti-slavery, he has a relatively thin record on slavery and Black rights. He'd never said anything like what Chase had said, that he was in favor of Black voting rights. He'd never said that he was in favor of integrated schools. So Lincoln would be harder to attack in the general election. That's the main reason that Republicans nominated Lincoln, although there were others, including, I should note, the bargain that Lincoln's managers struck with the Pennsylvania delegation, support for Lincoln in return for a seat in the cabinet for Simon Cameron. We are so accustomed to thinking of Abraham Lincoln as president that we forget how close the 1860 presidential election was, how easily this four-way contest could have wound up in the House of Representatives, which would probably have selected the Southern Democrat. We also forget that in those days, people didn't campaign for themselves for president. It fell to Seward and Chase and other surrogates to campaign for Lincoln. Chase campaigned for Lincoln in 10 states, including Pennsylvania, especially New York, the most populous state, where he sort of went almost door to door in upstate New York campaigning for Lincoln and other Republicans. And as we know, Lincoln did manage to win that election, barely, with a minority of the popular vote, but a majority in the Electoral College. Within days of the November election, however, some Southerners were saying they could not accept this result, that they would rather leave the Union than live under an abolitionist president. South Carolina seceded in December, and other states looked likely to secede in January. On the second day of the new year, Governor Chase received a note from Lincoln in Springfield saying that he would like to confer with Chase. And Chase got on the train and went to Springfield, where the two men met for the first time in person in early January 61. Each was favorably impressed by the other. And Lincoln told Chase that he would like to have him placed in the cabinet, probably as Treasury Secretary, but could not make him an offer just yet because he had made an offer to Simon Cameron and did not yet have Cameron's response. As you can imagine, this did not especially please Chase, and up to the day of Lincoln's inauguration, Chase was telling friends that he was not sure whether Lincoln would offer him a place in the cabinet and not sure whether he would accept. Indeed, even after Lincoln nominated him and the Senate immediately confirmed him, Chase had doubts. But Lincoln persuaded him that given the financial and political crisis, Chase had no choice but to serve his nation. So he agreed. Chase's most important role in the Civil War was raising the money necessary to fund the fighting. When Chase became secretary in March 61, the federal government budget was about $50 million per year. The federal government was actually in serious financial difficulty even before the fighting started because of the deficits during the Buchanan administration. By the end of Chase's time in the Treasury, June of 1864, the federal government was spending about $1 billion per year. So the scale of the federal government increased by a factor of about 20. Chase somehow had to find 20 times as much money as his predecessors. He did this in various ways. through new taxes, including the first federal income tax, through borrowing, and through some inflation, although there was far less inflation in the North than in the South. Perhaps his most interesting financial innovation is what we would call a wartime bond campaign, borrowing small sums from ordinary citizens and encouraging them to purchase the bonds with patriotic campaigns. Chase worked closely in this respect with a young Philadelphia financier, Jay Cooke, who does not get the credit he deserves for the North's victory. This, however, is a Civil War roundtable, so you want to hear about military issues. And somewhat to my surprise, as I did my research, I found that Chase, the Secretary of Treasury, was deeply involved in military issues. In the course of my research, I found wartime correspondence with 40 different generals in the Chase papers, and I found Chase deeply involved in what we would consider tactical military questions. The most dramatic example of this is in May of 1862, in the early phase of General George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. Lincoln, Chase, and Secretary of War Stanton boarded a Treasury revenue cutter in Washington and headed south to the peninsula. They toured the Vanderbilt, which was a vessel donated to the government by Cornelius Vanderbilt and fitted with a metal prow to ram and destroy ironclads. And they toured the Monitor, the first of the northern ironclads, described in some newspapers as a big black Yankee cheese box on a raft. Receiving reports that the rebels were abandoning Norfolk, Virginia, the key port, Lincoln decided to attempt to capture Norfolk. Not trusting the aged general, John Wool, Lincoln and Stanton asked Chase to accompany the advance, and Chase agreed. So the Treasury Secretary walked up the sandy slope of the landing place, mounted a horse, and together with General Egbert Veal and a small guard, trotted south, catching up after 4 or 5 miles with the main body of Union troops. Here there were some rebel guns in action, and there was a key bridge in flames, and for a few minutes, utter confusion. Veal, a few days later, wrote a friend that he was impressed by, quote, the facility with which Secretary Chase, without any pretension to military knowledge, comprehended at once the whole situation of affairs. Chase sent Veal and some troops around the burning bridge, and soon the Union march resumed on the other side towards Norfolk. A few miles outside of Norfolk, Chase was greeted by the mayor and other city leaders, who signed surrender documents and then escorted them into town. Here, Chase drafted the brief document appointing Veal as the military governor of the city. After issuing this order, Chase and Wool rode back by carriage to the landing point. It was almost midnight when they returned to Fortress Monroe and reported in to Lincoln and Stanton. Both men were, in Chase's words, delighted, and Stanton, quote, fairly hugged General Wool. There was more joy in the morning. As Chase came in for breakfast, he learned that the rebels had set fire to the Merrimac and blown her up. Without their base at Norfolk, the rebels had decided to destroy the Merrimac rather than see it captured by the Union. Chase wrote to his daughter from the boat on the way home, so has ended a brilliant week's campaign of the president, for I think it quite certain that if he had not come down, Norfolk would still have been in possession of the enemy, and the Merrimac as grim and defiant and as much a terror as ever. A few weeks later, on July 22nd, 1862, Chase presented to his cabinet his draft of a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. According to Chase's diary, the best account of this cabinet meeting, perhaps the most famous cabinet meeting in American history, Lincoln read the draft aloud, after which Chase told him that he thought emancipation could be much better and more quietly accomplished by allowing generals to organize and arm the slaves, and by directing the commanders of department to proclaim emancipation within their districts as soon as practicable. Chase stressed, however, that he viewed Lincoln's draft as so much better than inaction on the subject that I should give it my entire support. According to Stanton's notes, he and Bates supported the measure, and Seward opposed it, making a long speech against its immediate promulgation. Seward did not say, however, according to any contemporaneous source, that Lincoln should wait to issue the proclamation until after a Union victory. That, in my view, was a later version of this meeting, mainly uh, argued by Francis Carpenter, the artist, in his book After the War. In the weeks after this July 22nd meeting, Chase continued to press Lincoln on the questions of freeing the slaves and enlisting former slaves in the Union Army. At the cabinet meeting on August 3rd, for example, Chase, quote, expressed my conviction for the 10th or 20th time that the time for the suppression of the rebellion without interference with slavery had long passed. Chase argued that in the southern states, the quote, blacks were the only loyal population worth counting, and in the Gulf states at least, their right to freedom ought to be at once recognized. In early September, Chase prepared and presented to Lincoln a draft Emancipation Proclamation along these lines. In the draft, Chase noted that Lincoln had assured the Southern states in his inaugural that he had no intent at that time to interfere with slavery and had tried to fight the war on this basis. This had proved impossible, and the rebels were forcing their slaves to provide indispensable support to the rebellion. The time had come, therefore, to declare that all persons within the states which most obstinately persist in rebellion, that is to say, in the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, now held to involuntary service or labor and not for crime, are henceforth and of right free. Lincoln, as best we can tell, didn't respond in writing to Chase's draft, but after Antietam, on September 22nd, Lincoln again raised the question of emancipation with his cabinet. Again, Chase's diary is by far our most detailed and reliable account. Lincoln said that while the rebel army was at Frederick, he had decided that as soon as the rebels were out of Maryland, he would issue the proclamation. Lincoln was not now asking for the cabinet's advice on whether to issue the proclamation, merely their comments on the wording. The next evening, after the preliminary proclamation was published, crowds circulated in Washington, got speeches both from Lincoln and from Chase. Chase told the audience that he was encouraged by their enthusiasm and predicted that the American people would likewise endorse Lincoln's decision. Nothing, he said, had ever given me more sincere pleasure than to say Amen to this last great act of the Chief Magistrate. In my judgment, it is the dawn of a new era, and although the act is performed under an imperious sense of duty, created by the military exigencies which give him the power to perform it, it is nevertheless an act necessarily baptized in blood of humanity and justice. The end of the year, Lincoln again confers with his cabinet, this time about the wording of the final Emancipation Proclamation. Chase has a couple of suggestions, most of which Lincoln ignores, but one of which he accepts. He suggested that Lincoln should end the proclamation with some solemn recognition of responsibility before men and before God. And he gives Lincoln a draft final sentence. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution and of duty demanded by the circumstances of the country, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. And if you compare that with the final text, you'll see that Lincoln more or less adopted, with a couple of wording improvements, Chase's draft. The standard view of Chase and Lincoln is that they were rivals, that Chase disliked and denigrated Lincoln, that they did not work together well. And indeed, the title of my book, which may not be the best title, alludes to that view, Lincoln's vital rival. And they were rivals. There's no getting around it. First for the 1860 and then for the 1864 presidential nominations. But I think the standard view is wrong in that Chase did not dislike or denigrate Lincoln. Indeed, when one reads the correspondence between the two men and Chase's diary, and I've already given you some quotes from that, one is struck by how well they worked together and how much Chase admired Lincoln. In August of 62, for example, Chase and Lincoln attended a Union rally at the Capitol. After listening to the first speech by a Treasury official, Lincoln whispered to Chase that he thought he should say a few words and get rid of myself. Lincoln then gave a neat little speech, which was greeted by warm applause. Chase wrote in his diary that Lincoln's, quote, frank, genial, generous face and direct simplicity of bearing took all hearts. His speech is in all the prints and evinces his usual originality and sagacity. Frank, genial, generous. Those are not the words you use about someone you dislike. Another example, in the spring of 64, Lincoln visited Chase's house to talk with him about a patronage question. Lincoln left without meeting Chase when he learned that Chase could not see him because of an eye ailment. He wrote to Chase that he was, quote, pained to learn you are suffering too much to be out. I hope you will be soon relieved. Meanwhile, have no uneasiness as to the thing to which I am alluding, as I shall do nothing in it until I have fully conferred with you. Chase wrote back to thank Lincoln for, quote, your very kind note and the assurances it contains. These are not the notes of men who dislike one another. Now, to be sure, there were times of tension between Chase and Lincoln during the Civil War. One point on which they did not agree was on how to run the cabinet. Our administration, Chase wrote a friend, under the president's system, if system it be, is departmental. There are some questions which the president reserves substantially to himself. For example, those relating to slavery. Most other questions were handled by the separate heads of the separate departments. Quote, the president sustains me kindly and cordially when I ask him, but in general does not interfere at all, or even care to be informed as to the line of action which I adopt. The department heads were not expected to exert much, if any, influence on the action of other departments than their own. Of course, they do not expect to be consulted, except very rarely, in relation to any important matter involved in such action. Not being consulted, they are not informed. I think Chase is overstating it a bit there, particularly as to military matters in which Chase, particularly early in his tenure, was informed and involved. Because Chase was more concerned about Black rights and was deemed a better administrator than Lincoln, many radical Republicans favored Chase rather than Lincoln for the presidential nomination in 1864. Chase did not discourage these efforts. They failed, however, in February when a pro-Chase letter, known as the Pomeroy Circular, was leaked and printed in the newspapers. Chase immediately wrote Lincoln to offer his resignation. After considering the matter a few days, Lincoln wrote back that he wanted Chase to stay at the helm of the Treasury Department. Republicans in the Ohio legislature were not so forgiving, however. They reacted to the Pomeroy Circular with a resolution supporting Lincoln for a second presidential term. This prompted Chase to write a public letter withdrawing from the presidential race, although some doubted whether Chase really meant what he said. The salmon is a queer fish, said the New York Herald. Often it appears to avoid the bait just before gulping it down, and even after it is hooked, it has to be allowed plenty of line and must be played carefully before it can be safely landed. In other words, the editors thought that although he claimed he was not a candidate, Chase, like a salmon lurking under the water, was hoping to actually secure the nomination. Chase remains at the Treasury for another very busy 4 months until June of 1864, when there's a patronage dispute between Lincoln and Chase again submits his resignation. He probably expects, indeed, he definitely expects, that as in February, Lincoln is going to decline to accept the resignation. But to Chase's surprise and dismay, this time, probably because he now has the Republican nomination in hand, Lincoln accepts Chase's resignation. Chase departs from Washington at the end of June of 64 and takes a few weeks of vacation, something he had not done for the 4 years of the war. But by the fall of that year, Chase is back on the campaign trail for none other than Abraham Lincoln. Midway through the presidential campaign, the aged Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, died, and almost immediately the newspapers predicted, some papers predicted that Lincoln would nominate Chase. Other papers said that Lincoln would never nominate Chase because the two men hated one another. When Congress gathered in December, Lincoln learned that many strongly favored Chase. Indeed, it seemed likely that if Lincoln nominated someone other than Chase for the Chief Justiceship, the nomination would fail in the Senate. This was one key reason why Lincoln named Chase, but there were others. Right after the nomination, the president told visitors that he was sure that Chase would make a good Chief Justice. In particular, he knew that Chase would rightly rule on any challenges to the wartime financial measures, for in sustaining that policy, Judge Chase would only be sustaining himself, for he was the author of it. His appointment also met the public desire and expectation as regarded the emancipation policy of the government. Remember, it was unclear at this point whether the federal courts would uphold the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment had not yet passed through Congress, much less been ratified by the states. So Lincoln had good reason to worry about whether his Emancipation Proclamation would survive a federal court challenge. Although Chase was no longer a member of the cabinet, Lincoln continued to confer with him about policy questions, including at least one long conversation in March. And in April of 65, they had a fascinating correspondence about Reconstruction, about how the Southern states should come back into the Union. Chase wrote Lincoln a long letter from Baltimore, where he was holding circuit courts, pressing Lincoln to include blacks as well as whites in the process of Reconstruction. As it happened, on the very day that Chase posted this letter, April 11th, 1865, Lincoln gave a speech about Reconstruction, what proved to be his last speech. And for the first time, Lincoln said that he would personally favor giving voting rights to some blacks. He mentioned veterans and, quote, very intelligent blacks. Chase, reading the speech in the newspapers the next morning, wrote Lincoln again, saying that although at one time Chase would have been willing to accept this approach, Chase was now convinced that universal suffrage was right, both as a moral matter and a practical matter. Without the right to vote, Chase told Lincoln, Southern blacks would face white retribution. Chase suggested at the end of the letter that when he was back in Washington, Lincoln and Chase should meet to discuss the matter face to face. They never had that meeting. 2 days later, on April 14th, John Wilkes Booth shot and killed Lincoln. And the next morning, April 15th, it fell to Chase as Chief Justice to administer the oath to the new president, Andrew Johnson, at a small, sad ceremony at Chase Johnson's hotel. That seems like I've been talking a long time. That seems like a good point to stop and take whatever questions you have. Are you there, Adam?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
It's okay.
Just I was looking at the question and answer, and now I need to figure out my way back. There we go.
There you are.
Okay. Sorry about that delay there. Okay, so we already have a great question in the chat, or in the Q&A. So if anyone else would like to contribute, please feel free. The first question is from Craig. Um, why would Republicans in 1864 believe that Chase might be a better presidential candidate than Lincoln, and what was the thinking on this?
I think the first thing to understand is that our presumption that a president should serve 2 terms was not the presumption in the 19th century. There was a presumption in favor of 1-term presidencies. So, for example, something that just could never happen today. In 1860, there's a rally in New York for the Republican candidates, and people are marching around. It isn't Madison Square Garden, but it's a similar place. Imagine people marching around Madison Square Garden with signs which read, Lincoln in 60, Seward in 64. Um, there's this notion that 1 term is the right number for a president, not 2. And as Republicans are looking around and thinking, who is going to be able to manage the post-war process, a lot of people think that the right answer to that question is Chase, because a couple of things. Lincoln, we think of Lincoln as a great president, but during the war, he's viewed as a okay president, and in particular, he's viewed as a weak administrator. And even Lincoln's private secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, admit when they're writing his biography, years later, that he was very disorganized, constantly losing papers, constantly wasting time with minor visitors rather than focusing on the big issues. Everyone agreed that Salmon P. Chase was a good administrator. The Treasury
Hmm.
Department was well organized. It had run well. It had succeeded. And then the other big issue is Black rights. Those who are worried about Black rights feel a lot more comfortable with Salmon P. Chase in the White House than Abraham Lincoln. Yes, we think of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. And yes, he deserves credit for that. And Chase gave him credit for that. But think about the question of Black voting rights. Chase is on record way back in 1845 saying he's in favor of Black voting rights. Lincoln, I mentioned his speech in April of 65 when he finally, for the very first time in his life, says that he personally, he's not saying it really, how to put it, presidentially. He's just saying, my personal view is that some Blacks ought to have the right to vote. Um, well, and Chase is in these 2 letters, which I alluded to, is just scathing on that point. The Chief Justice writing to the president saying, no, you are just wrong. You are wrong as a moral matter, and you are wrong as a practical matter. Unless Southern Blacks have the right to vote, Southern governments will be dominated by whites. Southern Blacks will be in danger. And, you know, Chase lives long enough. I mean, Lincoln doesn't, but Chase lives long enough to see the violence of Reconstruction. So, um, as odd as it seems to us today, I actually think that there was an argument in early 1864 that Chase would have been a better choice for the Republican Party to manage Reconstruction, that he was more committed to Black rights and that he would have done more than Abraham Lincoln. We of course don't really know what Abraham Lincoln would have done in Reconstruction. This is one of those great what ifs that Civil War buffs debate over beers. Um, there's no question, though, that Chase would have been far friendlier to Southern blacks than the man who did occupy the presidential chair, Andrew Johnson. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it I think unless you understand that kind of 19th century one-term presumption, you just can't get at the question of the 1864 presidential choice.
Hmm. Thank you. I was wondering exactly the same question. So, and again, we're like one of the hardest things in history is to overcome what we think we know, and also what we just assume. Lincoln is the closest thing we have to, you know, a godlike figure in American history. I mean, maybe, well, Washington, of course, but I mean, for many people, they're unapologetic in saying Lincoln's my favorite, and
Yeah,
but we tend to look at Lincoln with a lot more favorable eyes than we do with than George Washington these days. And I think you've brought up the fact that he was human and flawed in a lot of ways, or well, at least is not the perfect
right.
the great emancipator that that he's known as. Um, okay, so let's see, where are we? We have a few more questions here. Question from Scott Rosenau. Um, Lincoln spoke in Ohio during the election campaigns in 1859 after gaining national fame from the senatorial campaign against Stephen Douglas. Did Chase recruit Lincoln for this?
Uh, First, thank you, Scott, for coming up to me and asking me to do this. So Scott gets the hat tip for bringing me to you by way of Zoom. Uh, um, y- yes, Chase and Chase's friends sort of sent notes to Lincoln saying, would you be willing to kind of return the favor? Because Chase had campaigned for Lincoln in 58. Would you be willing to return the favor and come here to Ohio? And the two men sort of hoped that their paths would cross, but they didn't. Lincoln is in Ohio giving speeches, and Chase is giving other speeches, and they don't meet yet in person until, as I mentioned, the first few days of 1861. But yes, Chase is happy to have Lincoln. I
Hmm.
mean, Lincoln again. It's hard for us to get into this, but Lincoln is, I mean, he's sort of an interesting figure, but he's not in terms of sort of hierarchy of the National Republican Party. He's very much a sort of a second tier figure. Chase is a first tier figure at this
Hmm.
point, and so Lincoln, Lincoln coming to Ohio was not quite the big deal that Chase coming to Illinois was.
Hmm. Question from Dwayne. Did John Brown's raid impact the electability of Salmon? I think, like as a presidential candidate.
Yes. So just to refresh recollection for those who might be relatively new members, John Brand raid is in a sense more important for the reactions in both the
Hmm.
North and the South than for what it accomplished. It really accomplishes nothing.
Right. Yeah.
But the reaction in the North ranges from those in New England who view John Brown as an American saint and
Hmm.
who treat the day of his death more or less as Christians treat Good Friday, i.e., the killing of our Lord. Um, to those who are much more reserved. Um, and Chase in public is more reserved, but the thing is, you don't have to trace very far from Chase to find people who actually funded John Brown's abortive
Hmm.
slave rebellion. And so, um, if Chase had been the candidate, and there wasn't anywhere near the level of what we would call opposition research being done in 1860 as there is today, but there was some. And if Chase had been the candidate, um, for sure, Democrats would have tried to tie Chase to his friends who were friends of John Brown. And indeed, we know it wasn't known at the time that there was correspondence between John Brown and Governor Chase. John Brown solicited a donation from Chase, and Chase wrote back saying, as much as he supported John Brown, he couldn't make a donation. I mean, imagine if that letter had become public midway through the 1860 campaign. Again, it wouldn't have had much effect in the South. Neither Chase nor Lincoln were going to get votes. And by South, I should really say the slave states, because places that we think of as part of the Union during the Civil War also were not going to support a Republican candidate. Places like Kentucky and Delaware. Um, um, but it might well have tipped, the key, what we would call swing states, places like Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Those were the four kind of key swing states in the 1860 presidential election. And a Chase nomination, particularly with the 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 taint of John Brown, might well have lost the Republicans those states and thus lost them the election.
Hmm. Right. This is a comment from Howard. I don't have any questions, but I've read all of your books, and I thought the one on Chase was especially good. Looking forward to your next book, and was wondering about not doing another book on a Lincoln cabinet secretary. But he's looking forward to learning more about William Howard Taft. So,
Well, Howard, how to put it? You are not the only person there. I was lobbied hard by various Civil War folks to tackle, Gideon Wells or perhaps Montgomery Blair and I may circle back to the Civil War with my next project after William Howard Taft, but I felt a need to try my hand at something different. And I will be, I should mention to those of you there in Pennsylvania, I don't have a lot of events on the calendar yet, but I will be at the Lincoln Forum in November of this year, speaking about the Taft family and Lincoln, and in particular Taft's role in the construction of the Lincoln Memorial.
hmm, right.
And
Um,
thank you for those kind words about the books. It's a lot of work.
yeah,
It's nice,
thank you.
nice to know there are people out there reading them.
Another question from Scott Rosenau. Chase had many famous disagreements with William Seward during the war. What kind of issues did he have with other cabinet ministers?
I think it's fair to say that almost any pair of cabinet ministers you choose to name, they had some disagreements. And Chase, he had a tendency to rub people the wrong way. I mean, he often came off as um, so self-confident that he was arrogant, you know, so sort of pious that he was sanctimonious. Um, so um, Chase and Simon Cameron really did not get along. And indeed, um, because Cameron was so such a poor administrator. Lincoln tasked Chase and others with bits of what we would think of as the job of the war secretary. So Chase was sort of responsible for military matters in Kentucky for the first year of the war. And obviously, to the extent Cameron knew about that and paid attention, he really didn't like it. Uh, Chase and um, you know, Chase, I talked to him about emancipation issues, and Chase uh, and Seward and disagreed about that violently. There's a wonderful point. I'd say in general, Chase and Stanton agree on a lot of the policy questions in terms of the enlistment of black into the army, the emancipation, but it's inevitable that the man spending the money, i.e., Stanton, is going to have tensions with the man raising the money. And there's one point at which Stanton has just, on his own authority, without any legislative authority whatsoever, has agreed to pay a bounty. And there's this bitter little note from Chase to Stanton. They had been friends before the war, saying, "You would not have done this if you were in my position." Um, so, you know, it's really, you know, remarkable, Lincoln's ability to recruit these very heavyweight men into the cabinet, but then to keep them in the cabinet. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, Chase serves from, the first day of Lincoln's administration through the end of June 64. It's not quite the end of the war, but you can see the end of the war from June of
Mm.
64. Seward serves, right through Lincoln's death and indeed through until the inauguration of Grant. Stanton serves from the time Cameron is ousted through Lincoln's death and well into the Johnson administration. So it's a testament to Lincoln's political skill and personal skill that he not only can bring these guys into the cabinet, people who, in many senses are viewed as being sort of more substantial men than he is, but keep them.
Hmm. All right. Thank you. This question is from Bill. Um, how did Chase compare to Lincoln as an orator?
Okay. I mean, there's no question, if we imagine a scenario in which, Chase became president in 1860, he's not going to give the Gettysburg Address. He's not going to give anything close to the Gettysburg Address. Um, he's better than people give him credit for. Prior biographers said that he was really just a, sort of kind of much more of a writer than a speaker. And I find articles in little newspapers, describing speeches that he gave in little towns that, people thought were really quite impressive. Um, and um, and he's to some extent a brave speaker. So circle back to the 1860 presidential campaign. He chooses to go. Um, Ohio sits just north of Kentucky, and he has friends in Kentucky, and he chooses to go and give speeches for Lincoln in Kentucky. And some of his friends, including friends in Kentucky, write him and say, "I wouldn't do this. We can't guarantee your personal safety." And he said, "No, I feel that it's important that the Republican message be heard in Kentucky." And so he goes to give speeches in Kentucky. And I mentioned upstate New York. Again, there's the after that series of speeches that he gave in upstate New York, the New York Tribune praises the work that he's doing there, saying that he's really, persuading voters who are sort of wavering between Lincoln and the so-called fusion ticket. The in New York, the 1860 presidential election is not fought among the four candidates. The three opponents of Lincoln all agree to a slate of electoral candidates that is sort of a fusion ticket as a way of blocking Lincoln, and that it's a very close run thing. And if New York had voted against Lincoln, Lincoln can't get a majority in the Electoral College. So a better speaker than he's given credit for, but
Yeah, but
a
Lincoln.
long step below Abraham Lincoln.
All right. Well, it looks like we just have one final comment. No questions. This is again from Craig, who asked a question earlier. Just said he really enjoyed the presentation. So,
All right.
um, if I personally could ask a question, this is
I'm,
on my
I'm,
mind
I'm,
since the very beginning. You were talking about his really. I guess the term we use today would be controversial. His controversial statements on black rights and also on, I'm trying to think of how he put it, about how his interpretation of the meaning of the Declaration.
yeah.
Uh, and he basically said, democracy, I'm paraphrasing, democracy doesn't ask what color you are or the place of your nativity. Um,
Yes.
so
But
what,
I'm amazed that you were able to get that as I
oh,
was reading it.
well.
Yes.
It struck me as very, without going into it too much, kind of a very relevant thought for today.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about his views on immigration, because I think, did you say that was from the 1840s
It
when he said
was.
that?
Yeah, and he's definitely alluding there to, I mean, the Know Nothings haven't emerged quite yet. They're the
Okay,
1850s. But but
right.
the but the anti-immigrant feeling it isn't yet a political party, but it's
It's
already
right there. Yeah.
a factor in American politics, particularly in, he's in Cincinnati, Ohio, which at this point is just almost flooded with immigrants from Ireland and Germany. Um, and the um, these people are viewed, how to put it, to say they're viewed with disfavor is a very mild way of putting it. There is really intense anti-immigrant feeling, and already proposals are floating to lengthen the time that someone has to live in the United States before they can become a naturalized citizen, or to simply proposals are already floating around to simply deprive immigrants of the right to vote ever.
Period.
Uh,
Right.
and and he's saying no to that. He's saying and he during the 1850s when he's running for governor, he has to dance a very delicate dance because at that point the Know Nothing Party really has emerged as a political force, and a lot of the people who were early Republicans, just a year earlier before they declared themselves Republican,
We're
are
know nothings.
were Know Nothings.
Yeah.
And so he he continues to take a very strong stance that those who have come to the United States and lived here for a while should have the rights to vote and all other rights. But he does it in a way. What he says is that we need to focus our attention on the really important issue, which in his mind is slavery, and not immigration. And he said, look, we can unite the Republican Party on the slavery issue. Let's not waste our time on the issues as to which we have some, residual disagreements. But um, he fully supports Lincoln in his efforts during the Civil War to to sort of strengthen the Union cause by opening the doors to more immigrants. I mean, circling back
Mhm.
to what will be your topic
Right.
next week with the the Irish Americans who make a slight appearance in my Seward book with the Fenian movement after the Civil War.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
so
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's fascinating that he was so, I mean, again, using modern parlance, ahead of his time. Just it's it's interesting to think that, we tend to think of the people who had more radical ideas of being less effectual, or the phrase you used was men of substance.
Yeah.
But to have someone like him who had those kinds of views is really very illuminating.
Yes, circling back to Lincoln, I hadn't had these ideas until I worked on this biography. But as I worked on this biography, I really realized that we may give Lincoln a little more credit than we should for
Mm.
his views before the Civil War, and in a sense, he deserves more credit for having kind of turned around during the war
Right,
to become the great emancipator.
right.
So, all
All
right,
right.
we'll let you everyone back there can immediately tune out and tune in the Olympics. I have to wait until 8 p.m. here before before it comes on. But all right,
All right.
thank
Well, thank you so much.
well,
And
thank you,
yeah.
Adam, and thank you, Scott, for inviting me. So,
All right.
all
Take
right,
care and enjoy the Olympics.
all right,
All right.
thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in 4 weeks back in person.